Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, we're going to talk about concrete again, and I'm happy to say that some of my dearest and most wonderful friends in the world are with me. And so, we're going to talk about a very special kind of concrete, which is carbon negative, big time carbon negative. And the special excitement that I'm feeling, it has to do with the fact that the CEO of the company that is producing this wonderful concrete, Brent Constance, is going to be with us, and let us ask him quite a few questions because, we're now doing a series with the Pugwash Group, the Canadian Pugwashites, who are very interested in trying to persuade the Canadian government to do good things for climate. And one of the things that we want to do is recommend that all concrete used by the infrastructure that the government pays for should be carbon negative. So we have to get quite confident that what we're recommending is possible. And Brent Constance, about a year ago in a conversation with me, assured me that he is producing big time carbon negative concrete. And it's enough so that if, according to their website, if something like 16% of the aggregate used in concrete around the world were using Blue Planet's concrete, they'd be able to sequester enough we would have the storage to sequester enough carbon to keep the world's carbon emissions or heat increase of below 1.5 degrees centigrade. That is one heck of a claim. So, good morning, Brent Constance. And I want to introduce briefly the other people who are joining us. And I'll tell you, they're all members of the Canadian Pugwash Group. Michel Duguay is an engineering professor, retired from Laval University. Peter Meinke is also a scientist, a physicist. He was the president of the University of Prince Edward Island, most recently in his career. Peter Fikowski is a friend of yours, I think, by now, and a friend of mine, but I'm happy to say also by now. He is an engineer himself by background, and very much interested in solving problems having to do with global warming. So his book, The Climate Restoration, is absolutely the best book I've read in years. Absolutely. I cannot praise it highly enough. So everybody must go out and read that book. Phyllis Creighton is available here. She is a member of the Canadian Pugwash Group and has been very active in the Anglican Church as well. Adele Buckley is another engineer and physicist, and Ellen Judd is a retired professor of anthropology at the University of Manitoba. All of them are just ready to ask you questions about Blue Planet Concrete. So, Brent, give us your own pitch. Tell us what you tell people who ask you, oh, yeah? Is there such a thing as carbon negative concrete?
Sure. Thanks very much. Yeah, I'd like to start off with just a few aspects of where is all the carbon on the planet anyway? Because it's surprising often that well-educated people don't always know. If we look at where is all the carbon on Earth, there's about 830 gigatons of carbon in the whole atmosphere. There's about 2,400 gigatons of carbon in the entire biosphere, all the rainforests, plankton in the oceans. There's about 38,000 gigatons of carbon in the hydrosphere, the oceans, lakes, rivers, ice caps. But there's about 100 million gigatons of carbon in the lithosphere, mostly in the form of limestone. And for all intents and purposes, on a practical scale, most of Earth's carbon is sitting in the lithosphere in a mineralized state. The other aspect is there's almost no carbon dioxide in a pure state on Earth. Even if you go to the methane hydrates in the ocean, they have methane and other gases in them. For most purposes, the only place you find purified CO2 is at Praxair, Air Liquide, Air Products, where it's been, chemistry labs, places like that. There really isn't a lot of CO2. There's dilute CO2 in the atmosphere, at about 400 parts per million. There's dilute CO2 coming out of coal-fired power plants at about 100,000 parts per million. But there's really no CO2 purified on Earth. Almost all of the carbon on Earth that's not in some biological molecule exists as carbonate or bicarbonate, and that's most carbon. So a lot of the fundamental approaches to mitigating carbon or managing carbon assume that we're going to be working with purified CO2, which is actually a very rare substance. It doesn't really exist anywhere. And even diluted CO2, usually with nitrogen in the atmosphere, is a very, very small fraction of all the CO2, of all the carbon on Earth. So that I like to start off there with that understanding. Also, when we look at what that looks like, if we take a ton of CO2 and we ask, what does that translate to? Well, if you think of mother of pearl, it's the calcium carbonate mineral aragonite. It occupies about 1 cubic meter. One ton of CO2 is equivalent to about 1 cubic meter of aragonite or mother of pearl. It's 1 ton of CO2 is equivalent to about 23 meters in a gas form as a purified gas. But as a dilute carbonate solution, like the ocean, for example, a ton of CO2 is closer to about 11 cubic meters. So it's a very manageable form of CO2. To put it in contrast, in the atmosphere, a ton of CO2 occupies about 1.25 million cubic meters. And so when you look at all the approaches to address carbon management, you start to see really quickly that all the approaches being taken today involve purification of CO2 from a dilute gaseous source to get a purified form. And in a purified form, it can be liquefied and managed the way that we see all these hubs developing, like for enhanced oil recovery. So what we're doing is we're forming carbonate. We don't purify CO2 at any point in our process. We simply take dilute CO2 and we convert it to carbonate, which is what happens to most of Earth's carbon when it enters the ocean from the atmosphere and ends up in the skeletal remains of marine organisms as calcium carbonate skeletons and eventually become limestone, like the Great White Cliffs of Dover or the Great Barrier Reef. Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, the molecular weight of calcium carbonate is about 100, and the molecular weight of CO2 is 44. So if I have a ton of limestone, calcium carbonate limestone in front of me, I've got 440 kilograms of CO2 that's now permanently sequestered in the crystalline state as carbonate. Now, if you look at the mass material flow on the planet, other than water, the largest mass material flow today is rock. there are about 55 gigatons of rock mined every year. And all the infrastructure to support the collection, preparation, transport, and utilization of that rock is already in place. And it's been in place for 100 years.
Mhm.
Every
Because that's what they use as the ingredients for cement, as well as the aggregate, right?
Correct. The limestone itself is one of the ingredients, if you will, that's sintered with other things to make Portland cement, which is the binding phase of concrete.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 3 or 4 billion tons of cement made that way every year, and it produces about 3 or 4 billion tons of CO2. By contrast, like I was saying, there's over 50 billion tons of rock mined every year. And most of it is used in concrete, not all of it. Some of it's used in road base and asphalt and other purposes. But what's important about it is the 55 gigatons of rock that's mined every year. Most of it is limestone.
Mm-hmm.
So there are other rocks that are mined, like granites, etc., that do not contain any carbon or much. But limestone is about 71% of all the rock that's mined. And there are reasons for that. It's softer, it's easier to mine. It's also more useful in concrete generally because it is more stable in the alkaline character of the Portland cement. So we already have a system in place that's been operational for a century, where we're taking material that is 44% CO2, and we're using it in building materials. We have all the infrastructure to move it around, and we have money to pay for it. And it's not just rich countries that have the money to pay for it. We're pouring concrete in the poorest countries of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And about 40% of all the infrastructure of concrete in the world is actually paid for by governments.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives government this incredible lever to mitigate massive amounts of carbon dioxide on a regular basis with the same dollars they're already spending.
Okay, now your transition is, instead of using limestone that's quarried, you're going to make the limestone, and you're going to use it. You're going to make it from CO2 in a nearby from a nearby flue, or someplace like that, and you're going to mix that with that CO2 with demolished concrete and some other kind of secret material, which I don't know. And that's where you're going to get these little pellets that become the aggregate in concrete, right?
Yeah, generally, I might rephrase things a little bit, but that's very good. Let me back up a little bit. So almost all limestone on Earth is the skeletal remains of marine organisms. Yeah. So the White Cliffs of Dover is almost completely a coccolithophorid, which is a plant that photosynthesizes. The Great Barrier Reef is primarily the skeletal remains of another plant, a calcified green algae that collects in the corals, and the corals themselves are calcium carbonate. So all those reactions happen with carbonate. So calcium plus carbonate give you calcium carbonate. And from the flue gas,
you are able to create this synthetic limestone where nobody else can do it, right?
Well, it's hard enough for us to get it done. If someone else can get it done, I admire them. It's been a lot of work figuring all this out. But precipitating calcium carbonate, there's nothing new about that. That's been around forever. There's calcium carbonate in our milkshakes and paint and paper and all over the place.
Mhm.
But consolidating it into a hard rock that can be used as aggregate, and let me back up a little. Concrete is about 80% aggregate and only about 20% cement.
Mhm.
And a big portion of that aggregate is what we call sand or fine aggregate. And another big portion of it is gravel or coarse aggregate that's graded very specifically by size and other things. So the value is in the rock itself. The combination of the sand, the gravel, and the cement gives you a structural concrete. I say that because precipitated calcium carbonate is a very common substance, but it doesn't have the market potential like rock does to go out and sequester billions of tons of CO2.
Okay.
But our basic processes are akin to native biomineralization processes. So my only point in making that point is that we're not purifying CO2, which takes a lot of energy, or trying to transport it around in high pressure pipelines, which is what most of the world governments think is going to solve climate change. And we don't do any of that.
Okay. Now, what you do is quite wonderful, and I know that you're doing it because Canada has already a major concrete company, Lafarge. Maybe Lafarge and Holcim are sort of twins or connected somehow, and they have a new contract with you to make concrete plants using your technology all over Canada and North America. I wanted to invite I did try to invite some of the Lafarge executives to be with us today and tell us about your plans, but they couldn't make it. It's apparently a holiday. and so I want to know, because we've had a number of shows about concrete in the last several months, and with people who are in the concrete business or experts teaching in universities about concrete. And mostly they never heard of you. And those of them who have, they haven't heard of you at all, but I tell them a little bit. And they basically look kind of agnostic about, they say, I haven't seen the numbers. I don't know whether they're really doing something that's carbon negative or not. It would be very amazing, and so on. But nobody really is sure. And we want to be sure, especially since on one of our shows, one of the guests was quite critical and said she didn't think that there was any such thing as carbon negative concrete. So you got to prove to us that what you do is really carbon negative. And I think my Pugwash guests will have questions about that. How do we know that what you're doing is absolutely concrete negative, carbon negative?
Just like everyone else in this area, we perform carbon life cycle analysis on our process. So, at our plant up on San Francisco Bay, we were monitoring the electrical power usage of every piece of equipment in the whole process. We know the carbon balance coming in the flue gas from the Calpine power plant. And we get a full carbon analysis. Generally in this area, and this is true not just of concrete, but anytime you're capturing carbon, for example, we refer to it as a parasitic load.
Oh, what does that mean?
That means how much CO2 you're creating in order to capture a certain amount of CO2. And to be honest, most of the processes that the world governments are proposing to spend billions of dollars on are not carbon negative, actually produce more CO2 than they actually sequester. Mm-hmm. Let me give you a good example, since we're talking about Canada. Mm-hmm. In Canada, somebody who I mentored 20 years ago started a company that buys CO2 from Air Liquide or Praxair, and they go out to concrete plants, which is where you put sand, gravel, cement, and water together. And they have these wands that they squirt this 100% purified liquefied CO2 into. And it's that 100% purified liquefied CO2 itself has its own carbon footprint because it took a lot of energy to purify it and liquefy it and pressurize it and transport it and all that. Mm-hmm. And about 1% of the concrete actually gets carbonated, turns to carbonate in that process. And it's been touted as a major breakthrough in concrete, that it, is a very important pathway to capture carbon and store it in concrete.
Well, actually,
but in reality, most of it just escapes into the atmosphere.
Well, I can believe you, and most of the conversations we've had with these academics and concrete builders have been of the sort where they basically are giving good ideas for how to use less concrete in construction so that there's less emissions from the cement, or how we should just be happy if we can have what they would call lower carbon concrete. They do not even aspire to talking about carbon negative concrete. So the remarkable thing is that that you do. Now, I know that last year you told me to check out something that is a Canadian system of measuring the quality of or the carbon load or whatever of concrete. It was called Carbon Star rating system or something, and that is apparently quite a rigorous kind of testing system. Tell us. I think you mentioned that you had done that, or you've been measured. Can you say what this Canadian outfit thinks about you?
Well, it I guess it uncovers the deception a little bit by putting numbers down on it. But the Carbon Star rating system was funded by the Canadian government and implemented by the Canadian Standard Association. And it's in use now. For example, at San Francisco International Airport, where we've poured concrete, if you even want to bid on the concrete there, you need to have a Carbon Star rating of 200. So let me explain what that is. Mm-hmm. A normal yard of concrete has a, if you will, carbon footprint after considering the parasitic load and everything, a carbon footprint of 600 pounds. And that's mostly because it has 600 pounds of cement in it. If you even want to bid on the concrete at San Francisco Airport, it has to have a Carbon Star rating of 200 pounds. They have a reach goal of a Carbon Star rating of 0, and then a regenerative goal of a Carbon Star rating of negative 200 pounds. Mm-hmm. Now, a typical yard of Blue Planet concrete, we just use the normal amount of Portland cement, so that gives it 600 pounds. But we use 1,200 pounds of sand. 44% of that is CO2. 1,800 pounds of gravel. 44% of that is CO2. So that's about 3,000 pounds of coarse and fine aggregate. And we, 44% of that's around 1,200, 1,300 pounds. So we're putting 1,200 pounds of CO2 into that same yard of concrete, which erases the 600 pounds from the cement. And now we have negative 700 pounds per yard in the concrete. Okay. So the kind of impact that has is, we're working with a number of the social media companies that are building large campuses here in Silicon Valley. And some of them are owned by Microsoft. and Microsoft has a corporate directive to be carbon neutral, not just operationally carbon neutral in their buildings, but in terms of the embodied carbon as well. And, so they're trying to find ways to be carbon neutral. And when you're building a large campus, there's so much steel and glass and other things. It's really impossible with most building materials today. And then the concrete itself is usually a huge problem. In this case, the concrete solves the whole problem and more. What's really interesting about it is, like you alluded to earlier, structural engineers and architects are trained in the very beginning to minimize material as much as possible. So we had a case for one of the buildings. The engineering team came in and said, look, we were able to cut all the concrete in half. And I said, is that so you could have a better carbon footprint? They said, yeah, of course, isn't that great? And I said, no, you should have doubled the concrete, because with carbon negative concrete, the more concrete you use, the more CO2 you've sequestered.
Yeah.
And when we look at the profile, a lot of those decisions are pure economic decisions, right? And if say I'm LinkedIn and I have to have a carbon neutral 200,000 square foot campus, I'm looking at all my alternatives. And, they look at buying offsets, which are real expensive, and we're not sure what a good idea that is anyway. In most cases, they could build a dedicated solar farm. And all those options are really expensive. We could literally charge 50% extra for the concrete, and it would only increase the per square foot price of the building by less than 0.5%.
Now, wait a minute. You're claiming that your concrete is actually economical too. I figured people would be paying a premium to get your wonderful concrete. But tell me, is it competitive with standard concrete in price?
As a means of sequestering CO2, most people think about $75 a ton, is where they'd like to get in terms of sequestering CO2. No one's near that right now, right? I mean, Microsoft's paying over $1,000 a ton on the voluntary market for CO2 sequestration. But the point I was trying to make was that even if we were to charge 50% over the market price, it would increase the price of the building by less than 0.5% per square foot, which compared to the other alternatives to make a carbon neutral building is almost nothing. To buy offsets, you're probably talking 10-15% of the cost of the construction. To build a solar farm, again, you're up in that range. So, it's by far the cheapest way for someone to attain a carbon neutral building. It's also just the cheapest way to sequester, capture CO2. If you look at what's out there now, every approach to capture CO2 is trying to capture it and purify it and liquefy it so it can be transported in pipelines and injected like a waste underground to get some sort of government subsidy. And the problem with that whole approach, building businesses based on government subsidies, aside from the fact that there's only 5 operating carbon sequestration projects on the planet other than enhanced oil recovery, injecting purified CO2 into saline reservoirs. And they're all fraught with problems. Yet this is what all the governments of the world are focused on, is spending money.
I'm going to invite the Pugwashites, because I'm monopolizing your time, and I'm sure that there are various people who have questions of their own. So if anybody wants to ask Brad a question, yes, here's Michelle Duguay.
I have been tremendously impressed by your presentation that was on one of Meta's videos. The first question that comes to my mind is, would it make sense to get the National Academy of Sciences on our side. The NAS is very powerful. Congress and the U.S. Senate will follow usually the recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences. Secondly, when you talk about governments in the world, I got the impression from looking it up in Google that the Japanese government has been doing some good stuff in carbon negative concrete. So these are my two questions.
I'll answer the second first. So one of our significant investors is Mitsubishi Corporation. And we are working with them and members in the University of Tokyo, where there's a strong concrete group. Japan is, there's a lot going on there. We have quarterly steering committee meetings with our people at Mitsubishi. One thing we found is that, government entities like the Department of Energy, can be very helpful. At our plant, we're building a second and third phase of our plant in San Francisco. We applied for a Department of Energy loan guarantee for a $260 million project that we're building there. And we just passed what's called phase one, and now we have to do phase two. And there's a lot of help there, but there's also this ingrained paradigm that we're going to address climate change with subsidies coming from the government, and that we're going to pay to eradicate all the CO2. And it creates these structures, supported by the National Academy of Sciences, that assume that we're going to build businesses around government subsidies. And if you just sit down and do the simple numbers on the back of an envelope, you can see that, only a few rich countries really have that possibility, and the possibility of doing anything significant in terms of climate change are de minimis. And I'd love to get the National Academy of Sciences involved, but if you look at the reports they produce, I guess I'll go on to the next question, but I'll just say this is too big for government.
I like that. Okay. Who else has a question? Yeah, Adele.
Excuse me. I have a couple of questions. I guess you're right beside a coal plant, and you get the carbon dioxide from there. Is it part of a carbon capture project, or is it straight from the flue gas?
Yeah, so we're at the Los Medanos Energy Center, which is owned by Calpine Corporation, which is the largest producer of electrical power via natural gas in North America. They also are the largest hydrothermal generator in the world. But Calpine was founded by Pete Cartwright with the intention to eradicate coal by replacing it with natural gas. And Pete actually built the Fukushima power plant and has a lot of history in power. So he was a real visionary. This was back in the early 90s that he did that. And Calpine has a fleet of about 86 natural gas fired power plants. And we take their flue gas and strip the CO2 out of it. But it powers most of the city and county of San Francisco with their power. What's interesting about it is they also, just to address your question, had a DOE grant to do CO2 purification and liquefaction and put it in pipelines and take it into the California Central Valley to be injected underground. And the project completely stopped because they couldn't get pipeline routes. They couldn't find secure places to eject the CO2. And just the parasitic load of purifying the CO2 is totally impractical. And that's been the case over and over and over and over and over again. But you're going to see these CO2 sequestration projects increasing. The IRA Act, I think, is going to put over $200 billion into these CO2 hubs. But the positive side of it is, and that's why I always talk about where's the carbon and bicarbonate, because we're building hubs ourselves, but we're not transporting purified CO2 around. We're just taking a thermodynamic downhill pathway and letting the CO2 form carbonate the same way 99% of the carbon on Earth does. And we're piping it around in bicarbonate pipelines, which can be simple water pipelines, not highly pressurized pipes with compression stations, which is really just part of the oil industry. Right?
Well, I'm not sure you're answering my question. I wanted to know where's the CO2 coming from. It's
a natural gas-fired power plant.
Okay, but it's not coming from the air. Hugely indirectly. You take it from a natural gas plant, which is, and you somehow or other, you do a bit of extraction of CO2 before it goes into the concrete. So that's all fine. It's just a matter of I'm worried about the label carbon negative. Certainly you're sucking in carbon, but carbon negative seems to imply somehow that you're taking it out of the atmosphere, and then that's not really the case. So
actually, if you look at the way a natural gas fired power plant works, is it combusts the natural gas, then it draws in about 90% air through the system. But it's an interesting arbitrary distinction that you see out there these days. If a molecule of CO2 is inside the flue gas pipe, people ask the question you're asking. If it's half a millimeter outside the flue gas pipe and in the atmosphere, then they say what you're saying, that therefore that's good, you're taking it out of the atmosphere. Anyone who works on isotopes can tell you that what's in the atmosphere is a lot of it is anthropogenic. It's anthropogenic CO2 that's going into the atmosphere right now. And we're never going to get anywhere if we try and make these distinctions about whether it's a millimeter outside the flue gas pipe or a millimeter inside the flue gas pipe to call it negative. That's never going to help save the world for our children. It's the same CO2. The CO2 molecules doesn't know whether it. How about this? If I go to a bristlecone pine that's 3,000 years old and I chop it down and burn it, is that carbon negative?
Well,
because it's a fossil.
Not, but,
it's 3,000 years old.
But I think it should be made more clear, the carbon negative aspect. I mean, you're not taking it directly out of the air, which would mostly people would assume that would be what you're doing.
So when a millisecond later, when it's outside in the atmosphere, am I taking it out of the air?
Oh, sorry. My second question, but I think I'll let someone else talk while I get rid of my coughing.
Okay. Who else wants to ask a question? Anybody? Derek. Yes. Hi, Derek. Didn't introduce you. Derek is a retired physics professor, University of Toronto. Just joined us.
Nice to meet you. We've hired a lot of people out of Toronto.
I have several questions about this amazing concrete, which I'm very interested in from a scientific point of view. What is the time scale over which your concrete absorbs the full amount, the maximum it can, of the carbon dioxide? How long does it take practically in practice?
Well, once it's concrete, it would just undergo the regular carbonation process that any concrete would go under, which is a few percent per decade at the most. But our absorption process takes about a half a second.
Well,
So we have a large packed column, and there's an absorption solution that goes from the top to the bottom, and then the flue gas goes from the bottom to the top. And as they pass each other, the CO2 is absorbed into the solution.
yes. So, so that by the time anybody handles this concrete, it's fully developed with the most CO2 it's going to have. It's not still sucking it in.
Well, it is a little bit, but it's just like regular concrete. It carbonates, from the atmosphere as well. But just to put in perspective, we're getting 80% of the mass of the concrete is the sand and gravel, and if that's all limestone, 44% of that is CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 4,000 pounds of concrete, we're sequestering, over 1,000 pounds of CO2. The amount of carbonation you'd get over, say, 50 years from the atmosphere would be, maybe 20 pounds.
Yeah. No, that's the kind of understanding I wanted to have. And when have you any experience with building tall buildings with this concrete?
Yeah. So you might already know this, but in tall buildings, every floor is concrete as a fire prevention measure.
Yes.
And for that application, you use what's called lightweight concrete.
Yeah.
So regular concrete is, 150 pounds per cubic foot.
Yeah.
Whereas lightweight is under 100 pounds per cubic foot. And that's obtained by using lightweight aggregate, since aggregate is 80% of the mass of the concrete. So we do, one of the types of aggregate we manufacture is lightweight aggregate to get lightweight concrete. In fact, our pours at San Francisco Airport on the terminal are all lightweight concrete, because, the walkways, you go out to the gates at the airport, those are all elevated concrete slabs. And so we use lightweight concrete in those applications.
Well, I see that you can replicate your plant lots of different places in the world, providing it's beside a source of CO2.
Sort of.
Of course, there's plenty of sources of CO2, but it doesn't, the implication by negative CO2 is I think you might be taking it out of the atmosphere. But if we would do the ideal thing, we would stop burning natural gas, and there wouldn't be any CO2 to go into your process because you need it that way. But there are clearly a lot of applications for your process. But
yeah, let me just interrupt for a second and say we do have several patents on running air directly through the same absorber, and we take about half the CO2 out in about half a second. So even compared to these conventional air capture systems that are being developed, since we're not trying to make purified CO2, which they all are, and that's why they're interacting with the oil industry to take their CO2 and use it for enhanced oil recovery to get the low carbon fuel standard credit. We can just run air right through our absorber and take it from 400 ppm down to 190 ppm, and we do that all the time. But it's the least practical way to capture carbon out of the atmosphere is to do direct air capture. In fact, you'll see it's been published all over the place just in this last week, but most of us have known this for a long time. Direct ocean capture is 100 times more efficient than direct air capture. If you really wanted to, the atmospheric CO2 is in equilibrium with the ocean. So if you pull the carbonate out of the ocean, it's about 100 times more efficient than direct air capture. Direct air capture takes 1.25 million cubic meters per ton. With a fraction of that, it's almost like Monty Python, what they're trying to do.
I 100%
even though it's funded.
On that, direct air capture seems like the worst possible way of dealing with it, because it's just so little amount captured compared to the enormous amount of expense. So not a good idea. But my other main question is, has anyone else looked at your figures and your entire system from start to finish and said, yes, we agree with you, and we're a third party, we have no interest in your business? Has a third party verified what you have done?
I think there's probably hundreds of groups that have done that, you know, for analysis, independent engineering reports for investors. And, you know, I mean, speaking of Canada, we got a $500,000 grant from the Alberta government about 6 years ago. And we, you know, the DOE loan guarantee program is a pretty rigorous thing. And all our investors, you know, whether you know, we're Mitsubishi Corporation, Chevron Corporation, Sulzer. Sulzer is the largest manufacturer of these absorbers in the world. They're our largest single dollar shareholder. We have weekly meetings with their teams of experts. But yeah, there's been hundreds of verifications of what we do.
Well, I think that it would be good if you would publish some statements from them. I mean, not if your actual information is proprietary, then of course that has to stay where it is. But if someone who is not connected to you would publish their findings that are positive, I would feel a lot more confident about you doing your process all over anywhere applicable.
That's what's so great about what we're doing, is all we have to do is do it. You know, we don't have to get the blessing of any outside body of experts that never produce anything, you know, or do things like direct air capture. We don't even care. You know, we're just saving the world here. We're not trying to get a blessing.
You'll get it anyway.
But aren't you?
Well, I guess it's Pugwash that's trying to give a blessing. Really, I'm not.
I want to get Adele's blessing, but I'm thinking what is normally used for this kind of proof is a life cycle analysis, isn't it? And so probably somebody's done a life cycle assessment of Blue Planet Concrete and ask them to, you know, send me a copy and I'll make Adele happy.
I think there's an LCA on our website even.
Oh, is there? All right.
Yeah, we have a whole department that does LCAs. They're experts in the area.
Good. I want to ask you about where you're going to get your concrete, because obviously you lucked out with the idea that you don't have to count in the demolished concrete that you use. You don't have to count that as against your the cost of making your concrete, because it was made, you know, it's made of sidewalks that were poured 100 years ago or something. And so it's like finding a rock that already, you didn't put the CO2 in the stuff. And so you're not responsible for counting it against your manufacturing process. And I think that if you, you know, once you don't have any more demolished concrete that you can use, and you have to find some other sources, I'm not sure it'll be carbon negative, will it? Because you'll have to count whatever you use as a source. So tell me, isn't that the case, that the reason you're carbon negative is that you don't have to count the carbon that was generated by the people who made the demolished concrete that is your feedstock?
Yeah, actually, most of the time we don't use demolished concrete, but that's not what, we don't get CO2 out of the concrete. We get calcium. That's our source of calcium. So
okay. So
that has nothing to do with it.
You don't have to count it anyway because it's old.
Yeah. We use basalt rock. We use slag.
Okay.
We use fly ash. we're really interested in the basalt rock because it's very common and it's very abundant. In fact, one of our large investors is Knife River, which is one of the largest aggregate producers in North America, and all their quarries are in basalt rock. And we found that to be a really good, we call it a geomass. It's a source of alkalinity. You need 2 moles of alkalinity to neutralize every carbonic acid, because the reaction starts with CO2 plus water, makes H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. And if you want to get to carbonate, you need 2 moles of alkalinity, like an oxide, for example, like calcium oxide. And any form of that, like basalt rock, there are mafic rocks like in Oman and California, but there's abundant supplies of geomass all over the world.
Okay, but as I understand it, there's a shortage of calcium. If you've used up all of the demolished concrete, where are you going to get all the calcium you're going to need next?
Yeah, calcium is one of the most abundant elements on the planet, actually. There's not a shortage of it. Both calcium and magnesium make carbonates. In fact, the most common carbonate rock out there is not what we call limestone, it's dolomite, which is a calcium magnesium carbonate, and it's more stable, and it's been used as an aggregate for, again, over a century.
Okay,
but there's definitely not a shortage of calcium.
Yeah, that's the source, but you're not going to go out and chip off a few pieces of the White Cliffs of Dover to use. You're not.
No, you wouldn't do that. That's a carbonate. If you did that, that would release CO2.
Right. Okay.
Right. So if you go to common rocks like that are full of calcium, like we're doing, like from the basalt quarries and other places like that, there's no limit on that.
Okay, well, all I know is that some of the other guests on my show in the past have said calcium is scarce. There are not many places where you're going to get it. So I don't
Maybe
know.
they're on another planet.
Okay, I can't
Just go on your Google and say source. What are the 5 most common elements on Earth?
Okay, and it's in a form that you can put directly into your use it.
Right. If you look on our website, that's our reformation process step. You'll see on the website. I'm sorry, I've got a group that just showed up, and I got to sign off.
Okay.
Well, can I ask one more question? Just you can locate in many different places, but what are there must be some places where in the globe where you can't locate, where they still want to build with concrete.
Yeah, ports are where we want to locate. That's where all the transportation is. It's been built up. The infrastructure of the world's already built up around ports.
Well, that's interesting. Well, yes, but the rock is at the ports. It obviously has to be transported there.
Right. When you're on water, it's quite different than being on rail or truck.
Yeah, that's cheaper, I think.
Okay, nice
Thank
talking
you
to you
very
guys.
much.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Okay, friends. And now, if you have any further thoughts that you want to share with each other, we can put another couple of minutes into this.
Where is a link to some of the more detailed analysis that shows why this is carbon negative and why it is economically sounder, or why the process works without revealing, of course, anything proprietary? I like to read about it, but I don't know where to find it.
Okay, fine. Peter Fikowski, do you have a good answer to that? How can we make Adele happy?
Well, I don't know how to make Adele happy. Maybe I'll take you out for a milkshake, but with a little bit of calcium carbonate in it. But blueplanetsystems.com is the website. So just Google Blue Planet, and I believe they have the LCA there. I think it's useful to ask, what is the question we need to answer One of them is, should Canada make stronger carbon negative concrete standards? Are there other fundamental questions that we need to advise on?
Already, the Canadian government, even before we started this project, had enacted some sort of new regulation saying that from now on, any projects that are funded by the Canadian government must be what they called low carbon concrete. They didn't say anything about carbon negative because nobody is very much aware of it. But of course, low carbon concrete is a lot better than standard, but it's not on the same scale, whatever, as carbon negative, because that's especially this kind of level of carbon negativity, I think. So now I'm still worried about making Adele happy. She really wants some hard numbers. One of the people who probably isn't with us but would have been is Peter Wadhams, who is in Turin, Italy. He teaches at the best polytechnical university in Italy, although his home university is Cambridge University. And Peter Fikowski had introduced Brent Constance to him, and he now gives lectures. He's giving a course on global warming and how to solve it. And he talks about the Blue Planet concrete in his course. And he said that the university is building some new building using Blue Planet concrete. And that he thinks that he could find some documents that the university produced when assessing Blue Planet in order before they signed the contract. So he was going to bring some numbers with him. And the reason he hasn't brought numbers is he's not here because I gave him the wrong URL, probably. I don't know. But if he does have these numbers in his own file, I'll get them from him and I'll send them to Adele.
If I may suggest, Adele, go to the Blue Planet website and download their LCA, the life
cycle assessment.
Okay,
Yeah.
life cycle assessment. Adele and Meta, is that the Canadian company Carbon Engineering. Are you familiar with them?
Yes,
They're a direct air capture company.
That's David Keith's outfit, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so they use almost the same process, except when because they take CO2 from the air or from a exhaust stream, and they turn it into calcium carbonate. But rather than selling the calcium carbonate, they then heat up the calcium carbonate. They call it calcining, but they heat up the calcium carbonate to release the CO2 again, and then they sell the CO2. But it's that heating up of the calcium carbonate that's very expensive and takes phenomenal amounts of energy. And so the point is that this is a process that's been refined. It's nothing new. There's nothing secret about it. The chemistry is fundamentally very simple. Brent has 100 patents or so on it, because, as he said, the hard part isn't the precipitating the calcium. The chemistry and is all well understood and published, and that the hard part that Brent brought in is, how do you make it into a useful product that can be sold, rather than Carbon Engineering makes it into a useful product that the oil companies use to extract more oil, and they make a lot of money doing that. A lot of us aren't crazy about producing more oil, but be that as it may, as I said, Blue Planet takes the calcium carbonate and sells it as a product for construction.
Apart from the National Academy of Science in the US, we should be able to locate something in Canada that can do something similar, that isn't necessarily a government department, because you're looking for something independent. I don't think NSERC would do that. It might fund scientists to do it, but you could look at, say, the Royal Society or some of the other academic academies that sometimes show up and do this kind of study.
They claim if the world shifted 16% of the aggregate that is used each year to using Blue Planet aggregate, we would be able to reduce the global warming to under 1.5 degrees centigrade increase by 2050. Now there's nobody else in the world that will even try to make that claim. So this is extraordinary. So
Yeah,
I'm impressed.
That's a claim for which we have never been presented with the arithmetic, and I think the arithmetic is very likely in error. Very likely.
Then tell me what we need to do to get the arithmetic. 440 kilograms of CO2
Yes.
in every ton, metric ton, TONNE, of their concrete. But they, of course, are producing a little bit of CO2 in the manufacturing and the transportation of this stuff and all that. So when you take account of that, then their concrete is 40% CO2. So
Meta, just look at it this way for one moment. The industry is only producing something like 7, maybe 8% of all the emissions, and that the concrete could reabsorb not only that but all of the rest of the emissions. Is what they're claiming in this claim, and I don't see how that could be possible. That's what I say. It's up to them to display the arithmetic. So you sent that out as a written statement, and I presume you got it from them.
I got it from their website.
Yeah. I think
That's
it's
the kind of thing that makes me worried.
and I think it's a very big exaggeration.
Then I don't know how to. I don't know where to go from here. I will ask Peter Fikowski I don't know who else knows the numbers. I will ask Peter Wadhams. I'm not sure where to go to satisfy you, but that's exactly what I want to do is make sure you're convinced.
If they're making that claim, it's they that have to do it. When you're a scientist, you have to prove your result when you publish it. And they're publishing a claim which I don't think is quite correct.
It has to do with the stupendous amount of concrete that is being used in the world.
Well, Meta, I think you're sort of right, but sort of not right. Well, one of the things that we really want is to get the reduced fossil fuel use, preferably zero. And as long as we're burning fossil fuels, that produces a source of CO2, which they can use in the concrete, and everybody benefits in some way. But none of this takes any of the existing CO2 out of the air. It doesn't go to help the amount of warming.
It's not a matter of taking it out of the air. It's taking it out of of the total amount that is being produced. And
of course, you're right, but it's not going to take us back to the 1.5 degree warming until somehow there is a way of either cooling the planet by geoengineering, God forbid, or do something which is different than burning fossil fuels and taking the carbon dioxide out of the flue in order to help build the concrete, which is quite wonderful, and I think it's beneficial by the sound of it. But we going on to claim that it's going to return us to 1.5 degrees C of warming is excessive, and there's no way to back that up.
Claim that I've read, and I read it very carefully, assumes that not only is their concrete carbon negative, but they can suck out an amount of CO2 equal to 14 times what the concrete and cement industry produce. And I don't think that's correct. I don't think it can be. The figures don't add up, but they should produce the proof. of what they say.
Mm.
And it's a pity, because this is a great project that we were hearing about. I'm 100% in favor, but I just don't believe that claim.
Each individual project is sequestering CO2, and I think that we have come to believe that that is true. That they're actually making carbon negative concrete, if you want to call it that, because it gets CO2 that was going to go into the atmosphere. It goes into the concrete. So great, we believe that. But they're sort of scale up to saying if we did, I don't know how many plants all over the place, we would save the world. That is something I cannot go believe. It's okay to just do per plant is an excellent activity, but sort of saying this is how we're going to save the world if we only did a lot of plants, that's the part that really troubles me at this point.
Thanks for very much for the invitation, because it was really great listening to this guy. Very important.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you. Bye-bye.
Okay, Meta.